Hi all, I have another curious game of Magnus Carlsen to show you from the World Blitz Championship. So this is against Daniil Dubov. Let's have a look. So Magnus playing white, kicks off with c4, the English opening. And Dubov, perhaps wanting an aggressive dynamic position from the opening, plays knight f6, c5, and after g3 he really fiercely contests the white control of the d5 square by playing e6, and we're going to transpose here after knight f3 to the Tarrasch variation. In particular, I believe this is called the Sletter-Rubinstein system. So white's fianchettoing, which I believe Rubinstein was the one that really pioneered this idea to have a safe, solid king, and the bishop having a kind of useful influence on the diagonal. So we see d4, so we're in Tarrasch variation. Its reputation isn't that great, it isn't used that much. Sometimes the d5 pawn can be quite vulnerable. We see knight g6, bishop g2, cd, knight takes, bishop c5, but black appears to have active pieces. Knight b3 hitting the bishop drops back, white castles, and yes, there's fierce pressure on d5 here. Black kind of gets out of the way with d4, but after knight a4, this looks a little bit counterintuitive, but if you look at this position, there's nice options now. Knight ac5 you might think is a nice idea, or knight bc5. In fact, technically, and because I've done an analysis for this game, there's a difference. This is often stronger. The big difference is you've always got then the option of taking the bishop and then coming back to blockade. So this knight on the rim is dim business. Yeah, it's interesting here. And also, you'll note that if the bishop goes to c7 here, black castled, but say bishop c7, white might actually have a powerful forcing move to win a pawn. Can you guess what I'm talking about? What would white play here? Okay, technically, and the engines love this, bishop takes c6, check. Of course, you're weakening the light squares, but from an engine point of view, this is position. There's not enough compensation, apparently. White should have a big advantage. It does look like a nice pawn in the centre to grab as well. Those pawns in the centre are more important. So anyway, black castled, and we have bishop g5, and you'll notice in this position, curiously, there's three options for white: taking on b6, taking on c6 with that bishop, and taking on f6 now. So these three options are hanging in the air, and should black be really worried about these options, one or all of them, or a combination? We have rook e8 looking at that pawn. That pawn is protected. And then we have the move h6, which actually technically should be a reasonable move, despite Magnus's continuation here, which appears to be winning a pawn. If black instead played bishop g4, the bishop could be a target, h3, and here actually white could play knight bc5, so this keeps the option open for knight takes b6 and coming back to d3, and this actually should be quite nice. For example, this is a wreck for black. It's difficult to see what actually black does in this position. It's pretty tricky. If rook b8, then there's can you see? Pardon me. 5 seconds. What would white play here? Okay, knight takes b7, yes. So that knight's kind of loose here. So it's tricky. If queen e7, bishop takes f6, then taking on b7. Yeah, it's pretty tricky. So let's go back. So we have h6, and Magnus cashes out. One slight concern for mere mortals like me is, in doing this, he plays knight takes b6, forcing, yes, because it's hitting the rook. Bishop takes c6, hitting the other rook, very forcing, yes, very, very forcing. Bishop takes f6, and you might think, wow, he's used all three of these capturing moves. And to win this pawn, okay, but you might think, hold on a sec. In doing this, first of all, hasn't this rook been activated? Isn't there a bishop which is potentially quite dangerous on the light squares? Because if you look at these light squares, isn't this going to be dangerous for white's king potentially? In fact, black plays a really clever move, because you might think, well, in that regard, to keep the queens on, actually white's also hitting b6 here. But black kind of treats this as a positional gambit, saying, well, exchange off queens. But Magnus refuses that, even though he's a pawn up. It's like, you might think, isn't that a bit counterintuitive when you're material up not to take the queens off? If white did take the queens off, then even if there isn't a mating attack on the knight squares, it seems here that black has active rooks and the active bishop, and there might actually be quite good compensation here. For example, this position looks rather decent for black. It's difficult for white to kind of unravel here, it seems. So anyway, so Magnus actually cheekily kind of keeps the queens on. The queen's looking at dark squares though. Now we have c5, which does seem to want to do something with this diagonal. Is it really dangerous? Is this the sort of thing as club players we would play, or would we just be too scared with this kind of thing? Winning a pawn but weakening the whole diagonal. Isn't this terrifying? The interesting thing here psychologically is I think you can take two perspectives on this. Does Magnus sometimes play like a computer, winning the pawn or going into very, very scary positions just because the material advantage? But I think that can be turned on its head, that whole perspective. It's not the notion of playing like a computer. It's really maybe playing like Lasker, the great psychologist, which I would like to cover some games soon. Psychologically, it's as if there's a big threat now of taking the upside of being material up without any downsides, because the threat being, what if white could block this bishop, blunt this bishop on this diagonal? White would be a centre pawn up, with central pawn mobility, and that will start to get bleak if that really happens. So black's also got an active rook though on this A file, and can this get into the game in an energetic way? We see rook a d1, queen e7, knight c1, so that protects a2 en route to where it's going. h5, black starts to play very, very aggressively. Is it going to be a form pawn, or is it just going to be taking on g3? A form pawn coming to h3, that would look extremely dangerous. Surely sufficient compensation. a3, this frees the white to move now. The white knight to move, not protecting a2. h4, is this not super dangerous? The knight now goes to d3. It's heading for a nice dark square away from the bishop. So I would say here psychologically, if white's going to improve the knight, but if white can blunt the bishop, that's a horrible threat to have to deal with. White would be technically a pawn up. It's also visually going to be in the centre potentially. And has that bishop got the prospects here? Rook a4 seems a very energetic move to play rook e4 looking at e2, or switching for an attack generally. It turns out here bishop b7 for example, the prospects here, as an example, if black even just took on g3 without a form pawn, this kind of position looks as though it should be okay for black. For example, that's giving black a big advantage if white plays totally wrong. So if white has to play a move like f3 here, which is necessary, yes, then this position should be about even. There's a lot of play for black. But black actually went in for an immediate rook a4, so reserving the right for hg or h3. And we have knight f4. And there was another materialistic opportunity here, queen b3 looking at b6 and hitting the rook. But that was passed up here. Knight f4, we have bishop e7. So how scary is this? We have now an interesting consolidation type move. Rook d3. So this sometimes means rook e3 to exchange off a pair of rooks. And to that, black played rook e4 here. And now we have f3, and the threat of blunting the bishop, it's with tempo as well, to blunt the bishop with e4 would seem to leave black just simply a pawn down. So this is a big threat, upside without downside threat of the upside being material. So from a psychological point of view, this, causes black to overplay his hand. I think, just from a psychological point of view, black doesn't want a position of pawn down here, clearly. If he plays rook e5, then e4, hg, this position, there's knight g6. There's technical issues here. f4, protecting g3. There's not enough potential for black, it seems, to do much to that after rook e5. If we look at rook e3, then like taking on e3, and this is looking greedy for white, but what does black do? Black is now 2 pawns down, and these pawns could get mobile later. If bishop f3, king f2, so black hasn't really got much there. If rook d4, then knight g2, this tickling move, seems as though this with rook e3, this is going to be interesting for white, more interesting for white, with a clear advantage. White's got that potential pawn mobility, a nice knight on d3, and there's no real issues here. So black, he plays a speculative move, h takes g3, leaving an entire rook hanging on e4, and Magnus actually grabs that rook, I assume with quite a bit of calculation here. G takes, and now king takes is absolutely necessary to play king takes. You'll notice the knight has got the function of the facility of knight h3 here if needed. If the king had gone to e1, then it's carnage time. If king h1, queen takes, and this position is just a nightmare. White's getting smashed. And if we look at king f2, the same kind of, more carnage on king f2, check, taking on f4. And this pawn is actually really dangerous for h1, so even if the queens come off, this pawn's winning, gives black a winning position, guided by the bishop. So, absolutely necessary to take on h2, calling the bluff here, check, knight h3, rook takes e4, the knight's holding quite nicely f2, and now rook g3, and Magnus all of a sudden is hijacking that g-file for a counter-attack, threatening mate in 1. And in fact, with an extra rook up, the game doesn't end to... it doesn't take long to Magnus to finish the game now with queen b3 check, and this pounces into f7, looking at queen g6 and then mate on g7, also looking at the bishop. So black's hopeless here, this powerful double attack. Rook g4 is played, rook takes, and then queen takes here, and that's it. So did Magnus play like a computer? Why does he play like this? Why does he win a pawn and encourage black to play with the counterplay? I think there's an element of psychology. Yeah, if the bishop is going to be blunted, then white will be a pawn up. So how do we look at this? Do we say that we're sort of being influenced by computers, being more materialistic, or is that too simplistic? Is it the idea we actually want to put the opponent under great psychological pressure to prove the compensation? Maybe that's more in line with what happened in this game. Magnus was saying, well, come on then, prove it. And black overplayed his hand at the critical moment, it seemed, with the rook sack. But it seemed to be worse if there wasn't. So it did require very, very accurate play to play with the compensation, it seems, for black. But, very, very interesting game, I thought. Now, even at this time control, Magnus sometimes seems quite clinical, intriguingly. Not going for like massive counterplay, letting the opponent sometimes have what seems to be significant counterplay. Okay, so I hope you got something from this. There's a play chess link. Chess World is much faster than before. Moved to a very powerful platform. If you want to check out the bit.ly link, I'm playing hundreds of you already, but I'll play even more. I don't mind. Come and crush me. So that bit.ly link. Leela videos. I'm hoping to do a Leela video soon. The latest networks are looking really good. Okay, thanks very much.